I have great pleasure in welcoming among us Professor John Harris from London School of Economics. Professor Harris had come to Patna on our institute 2 years back, and from that time onwards he has been trying to foster his relationship with Bihar and Patna. After a lot of preparations, thinkings, brainstorming, I think very soon Adri, Patna and Bihar will be having a much longer relationship with Professor Harris. We have a research agenda coming. But I must also inform you that those who are not present in the last lecture of Professor Harris is that Professor Harris has been visiting India for the last 31 years. And as my friend Shaivan was telling other day, he's an honorary Tamilian with immense knowledge about Tamil Nadu politics, Tamil Nadu society, Tamil Nadu economics, plus his knowledge about Tamil. He can speak Tamil, can read Tamil and whatnot. With this background, it is just his complexion and his name which stands there, says that he is British. For everything else, he is as much Indian as I and you. This afternoon, Professor Harris will be speaking on a topic which is public action, governance and development. Many of you, I see the faces here, will remember about 6 months back in this very room, we had a one-day round of discussions on good governance and development, and this focus of discussion, although it has been initiated or directed by some of the international agencies, World Bank and IMF, with whatever objective they have in their mind, but other people also have been thinking greatly and very quite anxiously and quite seriously how to improve the structure of governments in different parts of the world, particularly developing nations. And they say that it seems that far more than resource constraints, it is this constraint of governance which is holding the pace of development in these countries. Based as he is in London School of Economics, where a number of his faculty members are working on this field, including Professor George, Professor Harris himself. I am sure from him we will hear this afternoon a very informed discourse on the topic of public action, governance and development. With these words, I welcome you all again, as well as Professor Harris, and request him to deliver his address. Thank you. Is that right? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Is that okay? Right. Feel as if it's sort of staring me in the face now. No. Dr. Ghosh, thank you very much for that very, very warm welcome. It is indeed a great pleasure to be back in Patna again and to be with you in Adri. I'm
So I'm happy to recognize, I think, some faces around the table from when I was here 2 years ago, but also to see quite a few new faces. I say that because I will be saying I spoke 2 years ago about the subject of social capital. And social capital will inevitably come into my discussion this afternoon of the role of public action in relation to governance and development. But if at some points, some of you who were here 2 years ago and heard me talk about social capital think, oh, I've heard all this before. You know, I've been sold a pup. This is not a different talk at all. I do assure you that this is a different talk, and that I will be carrying the argument of the talk of a couple of years ago very much further. The role of public action in relation to governance and development. In the contemporary discourse on development in international agencies, notably the World Bank, there's a good deal of emphasis upon the virtues of participation, which is sometimes taken as implying also empowerment, and upon decentralization, which is seen either as the key means of realizing participation, or sometimes even as being more or less equivalent to it. And these three buzzwords, participation, empowerment, and decentralization, are used in close alliance with two others, civil society and social capital. The first of these, civil society, is taken to mean that sphere of organized social life, though excluding political organization, especially political parties, which lies outside the state on the one hand, and ascriptive forms of social organization such as the family and kinship groups on the other. The second term, social capital, refers to social networks, norms and trust, which are thought to be conducive to the creation of a robust civil society because they facilitate the solving of problems of collective action, problems that arise whenever more than one person tries to do something. But the idea of social capital is also commonly equated in the international development agencies simply with voluntary local associations. And in one celebrated World Bank paper, it's argued that social capital in that sense, that specific sense of voluntary local associations, actually constitutes the missing link in development. What's going on here? What are the ideas? The basic idea is that it's through participation in voluntary local associations that people are empowered in civil society. And a vibrant civil society, which implies the presence of a strong sense of civic and community responsibility amongst people, acts both as a vital check upon the activities and agencies of the state and as a kind of a conduit between the people and the government, connection between people and government. A strong civil society should actually contain the expansion of the state, prevent the expansion of the state beyond certain limits, because the argument is people will actually oppose the invasion of, as it were, their space by the state. And so civil society will make for good government, that is democratic, responsive, accountable and transparent government. It's expected too that in the context of such a strong civil society, people will be broadly supportive of the market-led orientation of economic policy, because such a market-led orientation in economic policy respects their rights to make choices. Some statements of what constitutes good government actually say that the pursuit of policies which are supportive of markets are as much part of what it means as responsiveness, accountability, and transparency. In these formulations of it, therefore, for the ideas and the needs and aspirations of common people, can any of us possibly be against parties of power and to hold out the prospects of democracy in civil society, of democracy? Democracy isn't actually a sort of rational, technocratically led process. Democracy must, to mean anything, must involve conflicts of ideas, contestation. I think the ideas of good government or good governance which are presented in the international development agencies tends to sort of push aside contestational politics. Significant that in the World Development Report of 1997 of the World Bank, a whole big book which was about the state in development and about government has at best half a page in about 200 pages which says anything at all about politics. I think that there is, in a sense, part of what the good government agenda, the governance agenda of the development agencies is actually about depoliticization. It's most significant that the concept of civil society, as it's used in this discourse, actually excludes what we might call political society, political parties, political organizations, and that the sorts of voluntary local associations which are endorsed are quite specifically not political associations. It's clubs of one sort or another, social societies, local community societies, not, say, trade unions, or politically affiliated organizations. That civil society exists in a field of power, or that there are differences of power within civil society, hardly seems to cross the minds of those who wish to see the space of civil society expanded and that of the state reduced. The whole discourse is, I think, quite deliberately apolitical in a way which is ultimately supportive of neoliberal orthodoxy. Here I subject it to criticism through some further examination of this idea of social capital, because in the ways in which this notion has come to be used, it more or less subsumes all the other key ideas in the discourse. Social capital is held in one famous work on American society to hold the key to health, wisdom, wealth, and happiness. And we have the authority of Michael Edwards, former senior civil society advisor in the World Bank, for the fact that civil society and social capital are terms which are commonly used absolutely interchangeably in that the most august and powerful of international development agencies. But why I'm going back over some of my earlier ground on social capital is because I think the critique of the concept of social capital itself starts to lay out an alternative approach which brings the state back and political agency back in and shows how public action, which I use as a label for the interplay of state and of non-state action in the public arena, may lead both to deepening democracy and to socially meaningful development. Better not lose my watch, otherwise I'll keep you here until about 10 o'clock tonight, I can see. I offer you two slogans. Down with social capital, up with politics. There you go. What a silly slogan the first of these may seem. How can one possibly be against social capital if it means networks, norms and trust that facilitate collective action? Indeed, my complaint is rather with the uses to which the term has been put than with the idea itself. In the hands of the two writers who more than any others have theorized social capital, Pierre Bourdieu and James Coleman, it's a useful but modest concept. Bourdieu speaks of social capital as meaning simply connections, and he refers connections between people. He refers to more or less durable social relationships which are implicated in access to resources and hence in the reproduction of class differentiation. According to this conception of it, social capital is certainly not a characteristic of a society as a whole. No more is it in the work of James Coleman, even though his whole orientation, theoretically and politically, is very different from Bourdieu's. For him, social capital refers to resources, basically of information and insurance, which arise from relationships between people and which are of value to them. There may be a public good aspect, but social capital in this conceptualization is not entirely fungible, and it's not at all evident that social capital enjoyed by different groups of people can simply be added up to a total score for the society as a whole. We in this room may enjoy a high level of social capital because we're all terribly well connected. But in part, our social capital depends upon the fact that there are lots of people who are excluded from our relationships. In what sense can we say that the social capital which exists in this group and another group can just be added up into some sort of social total? Doesn't make logical sense. However, in Robert Putnam's celebrated analysis of the performance of regional governments in Italy, which I talked about at some length a couple of years ago, it is suggested that whole societies may be differentiated in terms of the extent of their social capital. He aimed to demonstrate that the differences both in government performance and in levels of economic development between North Central Italy and the Italian South can best be explained as being the outcomes of variations in what he initially calls civic engagement, measured by political participation in elections and referenda and so on, newspaper readership, and the density of these horizontal voluntary associations, like football clubs, choirs, and most famously bird-watching societies. Later, civic engagement, in his work, civic engagement is more or less equated with social capital, which is also seen as deriving particularly from these horizontal voluntary associations. And hence the tendencies by researchers and policymakers subsequently to equate social capital with the idea of civil society as being actually constituted by voluntary associations in the space between family and state, and thus to associate social capital in particular with voluntary associations. These ideas, I suggest, are deeply flawed logically. The flaws derive from the basic problem that while Putnam's argument that interpersonal trust the basic problem is that while Putnam's argument that interpersonal trust is built up through membership in voluntary associations may be sound enough, he offers no explanation as to how and why such interpersonal trust is translated into generalized social trust. I mean, there may be a lot of trust between us in this room. You know, we're all members of ADRI or of some sort of fellowship which is associated with ADRI, with other organizations in Patna. So because of the fact that we all know each other quite well through our membership in this and other associations, yeah, sure, you may trust me, I may trust you in a way that we wouldn't trust others. But how does the trust which exists amongst this particular group of people, which depends upon our knowledge of one another, how does it extend to the wider society? How does it, the fact that I can trust you because we know each other through this club, that club, and the other club, why should that mean that I can trust some total stranger outside? There is absolutely no logical connection between the development of interpersonal trust in particular groups of people and wider societal trust. Clearly it's possible to conceive of circumstances and to find them historically, where there are groups or associations in a society within each of which there is a high level of trust, and in that sense of social capital, but where the groups are actually very hostile to each other. Does such a society then have a high level of social capital? I think the answer to that question is that it's really not a meaningful concept in that context, in that sense. The trust or the social capital that is built up in small groups in which people interact face to face and build up a lot of knowledge of each other and to develop norms of reciprocity is not simply aggregated together to constitute generalized trust within the society as a whole. Yet Putnam somehow seems to suggest that the whole of North Central Italy has more social capital than the whole of the Italian South. I don't think it makes logical sense. Civility or civicness, which is how Putnam also talks about civic engagement, actually implies, I suggest, notions of impartiality of treatment and of the equality of individuals as citizens before the law. The concept of civil society, too, implies the existence of laws and of less formal codes for conduct, such as ideas of professional ethics. It's when people generally believe in the legitimacy of these institutions, these laws, these codes, and are reasonably confident that the values and norms that inhere within them will actually motivate those who are concerned in implementing them, believe in the legitimacy of these institutions, and that they'll actually be effective in influencing the way people act. It's in these circumstances that civicness or civil society flourishes, and there's a fair degree of generalized trust in society as a whole. Putnam actually states this, ironically enough, in his discussion of the history of civic organization in North Central Italy, in which he actually emphasizes the importance precisely of laws and of codes of professional conduct. The existence of civil society, therefore, and of generalized trust in a society presuppose an institutional framework, a framework of basically of laws and codes, which is put into place through the agency of the state. If these arguments put forward by Putnam about civic engagement being equal to social capital, being equal to voluntary associations, are flawed logically, historians of Italy have shown, firstly, that there are serious errors in his historiography, in his reading of Italian history, and secondly, that at least as convincing a set of propositions about the social phenomena that he describes show the centrality of the state and of political processes. The backwardness of the Italian South is shown as being not the outcome of many centuries of a culturally determined lack of trust or social capital, but rather the result of processes of state building in Italy in the 19th century. And the existence of high levels of civic engagement in North Central Italy, both at the end of the 19th century and towards the end of the 20th, can very well be explained as being the outcomes and not the causes of the development of progressive political parties and politics in this region. Putnam actually notes an association between effective government in Italy and those areas where the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, has won strong support. But he never acknowledges that part of the tactics of the Italian Communist Party was exactly to encourage precisely those activities which are recognized in the measure of civic engagement or social capital, which he develops in his book. In other words, there is at least a strong evidence that it's actually institutions established by the state and the actions of particular political parties, political organizations, which is conducive to to the development of these characteristics that are associated with civic engagement, which are thought to make for a robust civil society, as that civil society is a condition for the development of democratic politics. Do you see what I mean? I hope I'm making myself clear. Critics of Putnam's more recent American work, in articles and a big book published this year called Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of Community in America, have reached the same conclusion that I have. One of them, a sociologist, Scott Ford, who's also a Harvard professor like Robert Putnam, finds, I quote, that US civic associations, associations in civil society, US civic associations were encouraged by the American Revolution, the Civil War, the New Deal, and the First and Second World Wars. And until recently, they were fostered by the institutional patterns of US federalism, legislatures, competitive elections, and locally rooted political parties. Her key point, grounded in a very substantial historical analysis of how Americans became civic, is that Putnam is wrong to suppose, as he often seems to, that social capital is something that arises or declines in a realm apart from politics and government. I believe that I've said enough to show that the idea of social capital deriving from Putnam's work, which is the one which has been so influential, is distinctly confused, and even more so that the big idea which has been associated with it, that voluntary associations are somehow the missing link in development, is misleading. But it's not just confused and misleading. It's also rather a pernicious idea. It's interesting to find that Putnam's views of social capital in America have been picked up most enthusiastically by those on the Republican right, by conservatives. Organize. Build community organizations. It's up to you. And I fear that quite a lot of development organizations in this country and others are doing somewhat the same thing. Part of the enthusiasm for constructing social capital and building civil society is, of course, that they are consistent with the neoliberal agenda of reducing the role of the state, partly so as to make possible large cuts in public expenditure. A good deal of the policy literature on social capital and civil society reflects exactly a similar idea of people pulling themselves together from below without much help from government or their privileged fellow citizens. How very convenient this is for those who most benefit from cuts in social expenditure. Down with social capital, therefore, at least in the way in which this concept has been used in the good government agenda. But these critical reflections upon the popular conception of social capital derived from Putnam also help to justify my other slogan of "up with politics." Civility flourishes and generalized trust exists in a framework of institutions which are actually established by governments and are consequently the subject of political contestation. I think it's also a misconception to attempt to distinguish civil society from political society, just as the ontological distinctions between state and society actually become very fuzzy when you look at them, when you look at the boundaries between state and society at all closely. We've seen that it's likely, in the Italian case, that certain styles of politics and particular political ideologies are actually more conducive to civic engagement than are others. It's actually one of the very curious aspects of Putnam's view of social capital that he should be so unwilling to make a distinction between associations like choirs and football clubs and those like trade unions or other mass organizations or political parties which have definite ideologies and public purposes. Finally, the view of social capital that I've been ranting on about for the last 20 minutes also abstracted from context, and particularly from the context of power relations within society. Is it not perfectly possible to repeat the example that I suggested to make the point that poor people may have large stocks of social capital in the sense that there are dense social networks amongst them and high levels of reciprocity and trust amongst them, but that they are still denied access to or cannot secure access to material resources. Their social capital really isn't worth as much as that which is associated with the durable social relationships obtaining between, say, the members of some elite club, the Madras Club or whatever it is. And this, of course, is why Bourdieu suggests that the idea of social capital suggests that idea in the context of an analysis of class differentiation. The decontextualized concept of social capital, which has become so popular as a development panacea in the good government agenda, obscures such issues of power and therefore of politics. And the alternative approach which I advocate is centered, quite contrary to what is implied in the current usages of these ideas by development organizations, centered on political agency. So I want to go on to talk about an alternative, but proceeding partly through an examination of ideas about participatory community development. The ideas of social capital and of civil society, as I've said, are important themes in a wider discourse which has to do with participation and hence supposedly with empowerment in development and also with decentralization of governmental authority. This is a discourse which holds that development which is built up from the grassroots will be both informed by and be responsive to people's ideas, needs and interests. Decentralization is thought to be, if not a condition for such development, certainly a powerful facilitator of it, and arguments in favor of decentralization overlap with those in support of participation. Professor James Maynor of the University of Sussex has argued from his comparative analysis of the available evidence that in relation to rural development, decentralization has, he says, lots of promise in regard to promoting greater participation and associational activity, though he notes, not necessarily amongst poorer, low-status groups of people. Has promise in regard to enhancing the responsiveness of government institutions, part of the good government agenda, increasing the flow of information between government and people, part of the good government agenda, enhancing transparency, promoting greater accountability, and making development plans and projects more sustainable. There is, of course, much in all of this, and it arises in part in response to the perception of the practical and moral failures of top-down development imposed by external agencies, whether well-meaning or not. It is a discourse which looks to action by and in communities, usually taken to refer to neighborhoods. Hence, at least in part, the enthusiasm for the idea of social capital, understood as meaning essentially horizontal voluntary associations, because they should help to build norms and values that will be conducive to the solution of problems of collective action. And given the near equation of meaning between social capital and civil society, what is held is that the development of local organizations means strengthening or consolidating civil society, and that this will have all sorts of positive developmental outcomes because it should make both for participation and greater responsiveness on the part of government agencies. I think it's very important to be aware of the limitations of some of these ideas. And in one of its earlier avatars as community development, so important here in India in the 1950s, participatory development is known often to have failed altogether, either because programs were taken over and used for their benefit by local power holders, or because people simply would not contribute time and effort to activities that would benefit mainly the wealthier and more powerful people. Second, otherwise, it may well be the case that in some neighborhoods or communities there's a lot of mutuality and reciprocity, but as I've said, that this resource on its own does not lead to very much. because in spite of lots of social capital, people just don't actually have access to other resources. Third, strong community ties, not uncommonly, actually constrain enterprise and initiative, and may be associated with social exclusivism. Both theoretical consideration and an increasing volume of empirical evidence suggest that for the potentials in local organization or horizontal voluntary association and community action to be realized, other actors outside the neighborhood have to be involved as well. A series of comparative studies in 6 countries of Asia and Latin America and of Hungary, recently undertaken by Peter Evans from the University of California at Berkeley and his associates, show that the capacity for collective action in a community of people is not a matter of historical endowment, as Patna suggests, but can actually be constructed, even in unlikely kinds of communities. One condition for the construction of this capacity for community action is that the achievement of some common end should appear to be a feasible possibility. But much also depends upon the social and political context of a community. While the energy for change lies maybe within the community, it has to be complemented by broader sets of ideas and organization. External linkages, which may operate through NGOs, social movement organizations, political parties, or indeed through informal connections involving individuals with bases outside the community, actually play an essential role in enabling communities of people, neighborhoods, to become effective agents in creating more livable societies. And Evans writes, romantic visions in which individual communities can somehow resolve problems of livelihood and sustainability on their own are politically misguided and a political disservice. Evans notes that the role of political parties is both more ubiquitous and much more complex than those of the other agents which may be involved in creating these necessary relationships outside communities, outside neighborhoods. He argues that suggesting that parties are the solution to communities' needs for external linkages would be foolish. Control, clientelism, and co-optation, and the quest for partisan advantage play much too large a role in the repertoires of even progressive political parties. Nevertheless, it would be equally foolish for activists and community leaders to ignore the possibilities that party structures afford and the way that oppositional parties can open up the larger political environment for new discourses and new forms of participation. And underlining this point about the centrality of political action, Evans and his co-researchers also find that allies within the state are crucial resources for communities and other social groups working towards the creation of more sustainable and livable livelihoods and communities. This is really what the idea of, I think the powerful and important idea of state-society synergy means. It's actually shorthand for the myriad concrete relationships of mutual support that connect communities, NGOs and social movements with individuals and organizations inside the state who put a priority on livelihood and sustainability. Though this should not be taken to imply that conflict is absent from the relations of communities and state agencies. Contrary, somewhat paradoxically, conflict is likely to be the first and foremost with state agencies which are supposed to be part of the solution to people's problems. In sum, the research that I'm referring to by Evans and his co-workers show that the realization of the potentials in the energy of local communities depends upon their relationships with a number of other agents, amongst which political and state actors are really the key players. Detailed studies of rural development in the Andean region of South America by geographer Tony Bebbington reached the same conclusion, where Bebbington finds what he calls islands of sustainability in the Andes. He identifies several common factors. One is actually the production of high-value commodities for middle-class and elite markets, which supports, intensive market gardening, that sort of thing. And another critical factor is the existence of local organizations and of external actors who have networks of contacts with non-local institutions. And he notes that an important aspect of the role of indigenous, local organizations in this case, is that they have actually challenged, negotiated, and influenced, I quote him, dominant institutions that marginalize the rural poor. Initially by invoking claims, especially for land rights, against the hacienda owners, the owners that is of the big estates, the church, and the state. In other words, these indigenous local organizations, which have played a very important part in creating the relatively successful islands of sustainability, as he called them, in the Andes, have played a very important political role in actually sustaining conflict with power holders over people's basic rights, including land rights. Elsewhere, Bebbington has argued that Putnam's and other discussions of social capital often understate the kind of raw questions of political economy and violence. Of course, one of the most critical resources that people need to be able to access is the legislation and continuing recognition by government, military, and society of the rights of organization and of association. Without these, struggles for access are likely to be unsuccessful. I would like to have gone on to have said a little bit more about, specifically about decentralization in this context, referring to the path-breaking, brilliant research of Judith Tender of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, based on work in Ceará state in northeastern Brazil, which was one of the poorest states in Brazil, which experienced a rather remarkable turnaround over a relatively short period in the 1980s. I'll just sort of really summarize the argument that follows from what I've been saying. The argument that she develops and uses, puts forward a considerable amount of empirical evidence to support, is that there is a curious paradox in decentralization, government decentralization. The paradox is that to create effective local government, decentralized in that sense, creating effective local government actually requires the state at the center to play a stronger role at the local level than it has before. One of the reasons why it is essential for the state at the center to play a stronger role at the local level than before is actually in order to support the interests of poorer, marginalized people against ordinary people, against local power holders. In the Brazilian case, for example, the way in which the government at the center intervened in the recruitment of local health workers, who went on to become extremely effective agents of the government. But what was crucial there was that the government at the center, that is the state government, intervened so that it was no longer the local bosses, the local big men, who made the appointments of the local health workers. Previously, the local health workers had simply been, creatures in the pockets of the local big men, to be used, really, to do their bidding. These health workers, after the intervention of the central government, became really rather effective, responsive and accountable agents in health work in their communities. It only happened when they were cut off from dependence upon the local power. That's one of the ways in which this paradox arises. Importance of intervention from the centre, really on the side of the ordinary people against local power holders. And much the same conclusion was arrived at in other comparative research by a couple of colleagues of mine at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. Did a comparative study of what they think were the 12 best documented cases of so-called democratic decentralization in the world. And it may surprise you, it didn't surprise me, but the most successful example they could find of democratic decentralization from all the recorded instances in the world. I'm not sure, where the east is as I stand here, but the little state of West Bengal, just over the border. They argue that where it can be shown that decentralization has been effective both in deepening democracy and in promoting poverty-alleviating development, as notably in West Bengal, it's in circumstances in which the interests of poorer people are supported from the outside. I quote them: "We would emphasize the overriding significance of the politics of local central relations as the major determinant of the differences between the successful and unsuccessful cases. Accountability and responsiveness is still most likely to emerge locally, where representation of the interests of poorer people can be supported externally in the context of a conflict between local and central forces with different power bases." They're making a similar sort of point to that which, or much the same point, which Judith Tendler makes from the work in Tiara's Brazil. This curious paradox that democratic decentralization really requires the state at the center to intervene in a more sophisticated way, but to intervene actually much more at the local level than it might have done before. So I'll sum up. I've talked for longer than I thought I would and intended to, and you've been very patient. It's time for me to sum up. The common threads in the evidence and argument which I've reviewed here are these. First, while all societies have the kinds of resources which have been labelled as stocks of social capital, the implications or the value of these resources is really contextually dependent, specific to the particular groups of people involved. Second, local organisation or community action are on their own are liable to be ineffectual or to be vehicles for the interests of more powerful people in the absence of significant external linkages, especially, even if not exclusively, through political organisations. Thirdly, simply, civil society is established in relation to institutions which are defined by the state. This notion that civil society can somehow stand in the place of the state is such misleading. Fourthly, arguments which call for participation, community action, or action in civil society in isolation from or as an alternative to state action. Arguments which more or less equate participation and so on with decentralization and take that in turn to mean the withdrawal of the state at the center. Or arguments which suggest that stocks of social capital or a vibrant civil society are conditions for the establishment of effective democracy and good government are misleading. And it's quite misleading to suggest that social capital, understood to mean local voluntary association, is the key condition for health, wealth, wisdom and happiness in a population. Fifth, positive conclusions at last. The realization of the potentials of participative community-level action depends upon the establishment of a political context which secures the rights of less advantaged or less resourceful people, often against local power holders, and which thus creates conditions for the existence of the kind of deliberative democracy in which people are actually able to discuss and resolve problems amongst themselves. Sixth and lastly, the successful realization of the potentials of participative community-level action also involves networks amongst actors at different levels and in different sites, including especially local organizations, political parties, and state agencies, as well perhaps as NGOs and social movement organizations. Had I left myself sufficient time for this, I would have gone on very briefly in conclusion to have given a short account of the campaign, the People's Campaign for Decentralized Planning in Kerala, which I had the opportunity to make some little study of earlier this year, which I think exemplifies absolutely every one of the points that I have made. I think what is perhaps most interesting about the Kerala experiment, which certainly involves a considerable extent of precisely that sort of involvement of the state at the centre in local, really as the facilitator of local action. Exactly of the kind that September describes from her studies in Brazil. Perhaps what's most striking about the Kerala experience is actually the use of local planning itself as a tool, an instrument of social mobilization and of participation. But I think the Kerala story, Dr. Ghosh, will have to wait for if ever you invite me to speak in Adri again, maybe I'll talk about Kerala. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you again. It was so very comprehensive, providing a framework, providing critique of the concepts, from the latest thinkings on the issue, and so on and so forth. I now invite questions from you, if you have any.
Dr. Harris, it was very much evident from your lecture as a civil society, as a social capital, very important for the in a socialist economy, it is the government or the state which is important. In a democracy like India, our civil society and the social capital, they don't have that much of consciousness, awareness, and ingredient for development. Therefore, we wish the goal, what is that is very much important there. But there is a lot of impact of the Marxist state government. Therefore, my question again is that in a democracy like India, whether it is public action or the governing, which should be important?
Capacity, Professor, simply. It's just that the sense of getting enamored by this clarity, substantive thought, and at the same time thoughtful, but at the same time highly thought-provoking. I have the privilege to kind of attend seminars and conferences at MIT, in Cambridge and elsewhere, And this, of course, has been on the frontiers of the debate, social capital. And I must say to you with complete sincerity that I have had yet an occasion to hear such a thoughtful and comprehensive presentation. Of course, a kind of very well thought out critique of it, which perhaps people who are even trying to, I mean, if they're taking trouble if they're troubled by the concept of social capital, I don't think they have come out with this kind of, logical and thought out critique. However, I'm intrigued by certain basic arguments that Professor has presented while making a very thoughtful critique. It seems, to get politics back in while discussing the ideas of social capital, one couldn't agree more. And I have my little excitement that the PhD research proposals they have submitted, even before I had the privilege to hear him, I've written something similar. So I'm completely in agreement with you that the way the social capital has been dealt so far by those who, believe in community, local associations, and by and large that's it being completely relatively independent of politics and power and struggle within the society. This is a perfectly valid critique. But then something logically also follows from this critique, which is troubling. If you do not have a very democratic, progressive political regime, which then has the capacity to ensure that the state synergizes with the non-state actors, and since you have read that Judith Tender's work, if you do not have those two reformist governors who come and take control of SERA, and then decide on this entire trajectory of the central-local relationship, the synergy and other things I'm not going to detail, how do you really bring those conditions by which that progressive democratic politics really comes into existence in the first place? So, now I refer to you, Professor, as your own very strong item of criticism when you said that not only the way the social capital has been dealt in terms of relatively free of political issues and contestations, the strength of the civic association is not only logically flawed, but it's a pernicious argument because it's highly kind of retrograde. Because then it says the middle people and those who have gone above, they say, well, you poor community people, you must organize and do this, you have to do this. Perfectly in agreement with you. But then my feeling is that there is a greater danger of the similar kind of issue which will arise when we will focus on, by and large, a relatively independent, variable kind of strength of political regime or democratic politics. Because then, the rest, all of them, seem to be outside. If one has to still recall the speculation of elite theory, that the politics and the power of politics is being, if it's being controlled by the circulation of elite, then the rest of them seem to be almost kind of path dependent on what will happen in the circulation of elite. Would they have any relatively independent area to make any impact? So it is probably this is dilemma of where is the trade-off? Are there people's actions which have there are possibilities of relatively independent people's action, which can then impact on the state, which in then turn leads to a fortuitous combination of, state-society synergy. You gave example of Kerala. We have heard that, in state in Kerala, you know very well, and I also have great regard for Peter Keller's work, who has brought out, and in the same Peter Evans' work and all, has brought out this how the state is promoted through the use of negotiations and other things with the party organizations, trade unions and others, and has promoted the building of social capital, has scaled up the kind of primordial connections to a much higher collective level of performance. But yet we hear that in Kerala the state is able to do it, because if any officer does any wrong, within seconds there will be thousands of people who will collect and sign a signature petition and say, how the hell have you been doing? Which is relatively independent. The capacity of people to organize in thousands of numbers and sign a signature to ensure that this particular official and the organization becomes responsive. Did it come first? Was it relatively independent? Did it have some historical links by which this capacity came in? And then the state was responding to it and in the process further promoting their strength? Or is it that the state acquired that capacity first and did something by which this capacity of people arose? So that's the kind of issue which I see, because I see also a danger that there's if you look, for example, examples of what happened in Anand in India, and it was outside state, and Korean, when he will come to an IS academy, he will make it a point to kind of despise the bureaucracy in state and say, look here, we the people organize this massive people's organizations to provide the best of the collective developmental outcome. And such experiments, and those where small NGOs and civic associations do a kind of a network, and then make a major scaling up, leading to a kind of an international movement, either on environmental issues or on education. They all perhaps would be, I feel might get negatively served by this perhaps, apparently very important, very valid, but perhaps analytically a disproportionate emphasis on the issue of the politics being the one which is the prime mover. And I had one small, if you allow me, one small other area which also I got troubled was that I think Professor Harris had found one of the central foundation of your critique is the issue of how the trust relationship between small groups aggregates, and you're saying, well, it's not logically possible that small choir societies, small football societies, and if they have this trust, and if we have this trust, and we'll see how is it going to really scale up and aggregate in a manner that becomes a collective force for the greater good. Now, my reading is that you can perhaps are considering the importance of this trust relationship. But what you're arguing is that the way the social capital is being argued by Patna and others is that this trust relationship, which is visible, which is perhaps even measurable in the small communities, in some magical way they argue that gets aggregated up. And you are saying, well, we must know how it gets aggregated up, A, and B, it's most likely that it will not, because there's problems of interest and contestation. But my feeling is that what mechanisms of aggregations. If I am a member of let's say, artist society, and there is another society of intellectual debate, I don't know each and every person, but if I know that there is A society, and B, that the society has a credibility, I meet a person, only one of that society, and make certain kind of interactions and get gauged that how sincere are they, and that gets translated for the entire group. So that perhaps can be a possible positive scenario of aggregation, or the dynamics of aggregation. So to completely rule out a possibility of aggregation is, I think I would perhaps see with some suspicion. There is possibility, but I totally agree with you that in empirical worlds, if you try to capture the examples of such positive aggregation or scaling up, there will be very few of it. And in fact, these organizations will come and contest and conflict when the interest issue will really dominate the entire process of achieving the collective good, which is by and large the things which abound, but it does not mean that aggregation in a very positive, very optimal manner would not be a possibility. Thank you.
So I have a small question.
Similar to the one which Srivastava had, but in a slightly different context. You have mentioned that the state, at the top, with its kind of benign dictatorship, or a kind of a nurturing environment that the state provides at the local level, that facilitates the growth of civil society and leads to good governance at the local level, which without this intervention would perhaps have not been possible. Now this brings us, and the examples to be quoted, of course, apart from Judith Tender's research in Brazil, two examples that you have quoted are Kerala and Bengal. Now both of these, to start with, have a higher level of social awareness, literacy, and a history of social action. Now, this in turn perhaps would have, influenced the way the politics in these two states develop, and that again would have encouraged local action in a way. For instance, local self-government, panchayats in Kerala as well as in Bengal. Now, all these issues are related: social awareness, high literacy rates,
perhaps less class differentiation than in other states of India. These would have led to a particular kind of politics being followed in these states, and again would have impacted upon encouraging civil action and civil society. This is one point. The other point that I wanted to make was that Patna also said, and he doesn't say that civil society or civic engagement grew irrespective of or independent of state action. What he said was there was a symbiotic relationship, a synergy. Greater civic engagement led to better governance, which in turn led to more civic engagement. So it went into a virtuous cycle, virtuous spiral. Whereas in the case of southern Italy, it went the other way. So what I have in mind is that these two aspects are interrelated. You can't really say that civil society, because it keeps politics out, is standing in isolation, and it has to be viewed in isolation, and it is only politics which will impact upon civil society, and then from there it takes off.
Because I'll have next bunch of questions after this set is responded to.
Thank you very much. Very good, some very good comments. Thank you. Should I just sort of very quickly respond to the more factual question of how do you measure it? Well, I said this in passing, but Robert Putnam, who really sort of started this ball rolling, which is work on regional governments in Italy, was interested in trying to explain the variations in the performance of regional governments. He came up, first of all, with a measure of what he calls civic engagement. The measure of civic engagement is given by, comes from data on political participation, which is given, I think, that Italy is one of those countries where, people are required to vote in elections. There's a law that says you must go and vote. So it's not actually electoral participation which is used, but participation in referenda, which have been, national referenda which have been used quite commonly in contemporary Italy. There's another measure of political participation which has to do with particular detail of the Italian electoral system. Okay, there's a measure of political participation. Newspaper readership. Now, how many newspapers per head of population? And the density of these voluntary associations. And he combines these with a single index of civic engagement. He later actually says, well, civic engagement equals social capital, and really comes around to arguing that what's most important, it seems, is, and this is certainly the case with his work on the United States, what is most important is membership in voluntary local associations. So you would say, if you could find that in Patna there are 5,000 voluntary local associations with 50,000 members, and that in another city of a similar sort of size, there are only half as many associations with 2/3 as many members, then Patna has more social capital than that other city. Well, that's putting it rather simply, but that basically is the argument which has been developed. Several people have tried to construct an index of social capital across Indian states. I think the best is in as yet unpublished work by Peter Mayer of the The University of Adelaide, is there a University in Adelaide? The University of South Australia in Adelaide? Anyway, yes, the University of Adelaide. It's Adelaide, isn't it? Yeah. Now, if I remember correctly, Peter produces an index which is modelled on Putnam's for Italy, and he does get data, I think, on the circulation of newspapers in different Indian states. He uses data on electoral participation from 1952 through. Instead of, because we don't really have very reliable data on the numbers of voluntary associations, we don't know how many bird-watching societies and choirs and, I don't know, Ravindra Sangeet groups or whatever there are in Patna or anywhere else. He takes membership in primary cooperative societies as a sort of measure of belonging. And then, for reasons which it would take a long time perhaps to explain, will maybe strike you as being rather curious, but actually is, for a sociologist, entirely logical. He also takes data on the incidence of suicide in different states. It goes back to Durham. So we've got these four, which is sort of comparable with Putnam, and he produces an index of social capital for different states. I'd like to have a straw poll. I wish we could. I'd like it's lovely if you could all write down on a piece of paper, which state you think would be top, have most social capital, and which state you would expect to have least social capital. But I don't think we've got time for that. So can I just ask for offers? Which state do you think would turn out to have most social capital? Gujarat. Kerala. Any more offers? Maharashtra. Two votes to Kerala. One for Gujarat, one for Maharashtra. And which states would have least social capital? Bihar. Any other offers? Possibly Rajasthan? UP? That's interesting. I mean, I think you've got there as far as bottom. I think I remember, it's UP actually sits at the bottom, and Bihar, Bihar and UP pretty much at the bottom, and Kerala is it's almost off the graph, according to Peter's analysis. Also high is Tamil Nadu, Gujarat. Tamil Nadu actually comes right up there, a long way behind. But then, as I recall, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Maharashtra are all sort of clustered fairly close together. Karnataka is sort of fairly high, and then we sort of come down to the usual kind of thing with the Hindi heartland states being somewhere near the bottom. I mean, take that or leave it as you will. It's a fun kind of exercise, but I don't actually think it really tells us very, very much, and it's partly because of precisely the problems of sort of circularity, which you referred to so very clearly in your comments. So I hope that answers your question about how it's measured.
What happens when some of these associations are mutually contradictory? They take opposite roles as they need.
Precisely, one of my problems with saying that, counting up how many associations there are, or how many tea shops there are, or how many, because I just don't see how, I will say more about this in response to Manoj's comment, I just don't see how it all kind of aggregates up to some nice social total, precisely.
In Bihar, for example, in certain areas, there are very strong organizations of landowners.
Mm-hmm.
and an equally strong organization of the landless who fight each other. Would you regard that as instances of social capital of contradictory nature?
I think that one could well argue that the extent of organisation in rural society in parts of Bihar is indicative of high levels of social capital. But, social capital has both positive and negative sorts of aspects. And, the fact that there are quite strong networks amongst... It doesn't aggregate, it doesn't mean anything. To say that there are 5 landowners' armies and 4 tremendously powerful unions of agricultural labourers in this part of Bihar, and that involves several thousands of people. And there's nothing comparable with that anywhere else in the country, which may well be true. That means to say there's more social capital in Bhojpur than Manoj would probably say there is. More social capital in Bhojpur than in Coimbatore. It's meaningless. It's meaningless.
But all this has to be conceived in the context of development, because your public action and governance are all in the context of development.
Okay. So let me come away from social capital and come back to public action, governance and development, and also to the points that the other gentlemen have raised.
No, you have rightly told that voluntary association without any political party type. So if we take it in that context, then the question of conflict between associations, landlords and landowners doesn't arise.
In the sense that Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze used that term, public action, to mean action, both by state authorities and by people in the public arena. I do think that good government exists in those. That is government which is responsive, tolerably responsive to people, which is accountable to them. More difficulty with transparency, but I suppose I'll throw in transparency as well. Government which has these sorts of characteristics, I think, does depend upon the existence of public action. In other words, of some sort of interplay between governmental agency and people's agency. The second sort of part of the crucial part of the argument is that community action, civic action, as I think is well shown in the Evans research that I was referring to, the participation at the level of the neighbourhood, the community, really actually depends upon that local energy being wired up outside, existing in a context of a wider network of relationships. Now, that wider network of relationships may sometimes be mediated by particular individuals. Somebody who, an engineer, a doctor, a former civil servant, whoever. Somebody who is himself or herself actually connected and who can make bridges between the local community and people who can do fix things in Patna or whatever it is. I mean, that's a simple example, but perhaps more commonly, community action is facilitated by, sometimes by NGOs. So I think the success and effectiveness of NGOs, and I speak as a former NGO worker myself, I think that the effectiveness of NGOs is often overrated. These sorts of external links and connections which are necessary for really harnessing and channeling the energy which exists in communities at the neighbourhood level, that may be facilitated through social movements. But it's also very often actually facilitated by political organisations, political parties. So, I mean, the argument I'm putting about public action, governance and development, is really quite a simple one, but it is quite deliberately pitched against what I think is extremely misleading about a lot of what is argued and said about community development and participation, and which somehow supposes that people are spontaneously kind of organise and do things for themselves. No, we have to think in terms of wider relationships, and hence I'm using public action in a sense as a label for those wider relationships. That brings me on to the points which Manoj and, sorry, I don't know your name.
My name is
Dev. The sort of more critical points that you raised. Of course, I am putting, mine is a debating case. And I am debating with the most powerful development actor, which is the World Bank. Internationally, the most powerful development actor, if not in India. And I accept some of your points. Your basic point is that while I may be right in my argument that it's not kind of civil society and social capital which gives rise to this kind of politics. The sort of progressive politics that has been implicit in much that I've been talking about. While my argument may be right, it's an opposite argument. It's think not in terms of A leads to B or B leads to A, but of A and B being actually intrinsically sort of interrelated. Now, basically, I accept that argument. No, mine is a debating case because I'm actually struggling against what I see as being a profoundly misleading discourse, body of writing which depoliticizes, which tries to push aside. It's the point that I was saying that 200 pages of the World Development Report on government has half a page at most on politics, and it is so much leading people astray to neglect the importance of political agency. And that sort of way is coming to Manoj's second point, I think, about your first point about what happens if you don't have democratic sort of progressive parties. Is one sort of stuck, as it were, in some kind of historical path dependency? You're just stuck with metaphorically or literally the BJP rather than the CPIM. Aren't there possibilities of relatively independent people's organisation? I say yes, of course. Of course there is. But I think that relatively independent people's organisation, the action of relatively independent people's organisation very often quite quickly becomes political. It is political. And then, what it amounts to in the longer term really depends, I think, again, on how that action is connected up in a wider sort of context. You will probably know this example. I was talking about it with friends in Adri a couple of days ago. But of course, some of the most striking politics in Britain, as I said, in the recent past, has been what happened in September, when the entire country was, as I said, held to ransom by a very small group of farmers and of lorry owners who were protesting about fuel prices. No organisation, it had no leader, starting with one guy who just, a farmer who was thoroughly fed up. And he went and he sort of sat outside an oil refinery in the northeast of England. He got on his mobile phone and he spoke to a few of his mates. And they came too. And they spoke to more of their friends and they came too. And in no time at all, the oil refinery was blockaded. No lorries could get out. Within about 36 hours, every single oil refinery in the country was being blockaded by just a few hundred people in each case. So altogether, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people were involved in this protest. The government had to back down. It cost Tony Blair his extraordinary popularity in the political opinion polls. Labour lost a 20% lead over the Conservatives like that, because this popular action by all the unlikely people, farmers, who in Britain are a highly pampered part of the community, beneficiaries of tremendous subsidies, and lorry owners, who are hardly kind of in the van of progressive political action. These unlikely people, farmers and lorry owners, won terrific kind of popular support, and the government had to back down over fuel prices. That wasn't organised politically. Of course, it was a very profoundly political act, but it shows what can be done. But the longer-term implications of that kind of the sort of social movement, surely depends upon the way in which it's connected up politically. Because that's just a single issue agitation. We want cheaper diesel. And then, apart from that, those people have divergent views about things. They have no program, they have no practice. So sort of developing that sort of politics, developing that sort of citizens' action, seems to me, ultimately requires some kind of a programmatic kind of political framework, just to kind of come back. I'll shut up because I've talked too long. There were some other points, but I think I've dealt with most.
Well, sir, here is your thesis will work well if the voluntary associations and organizations don't have any conflicting interest. But if they do have a conflicting interest, as Professor Bose said, and if there is civil war type of situation in the civil society, in that case the civil society and social capital will not have any role. And in that case,
please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understood, as I heard, that you have spoken about these conceptual categories with a very uniform understanding about them. And it rather surprises me for somebody who has researched in Bihar for 31 years, he should know better that, anyway, at least in India, he should know better that it's through fragmented public action that we are having governance in Bihar for last so many years. That's what.
It's not so much a civil society.
Even the civil society is very fragmented, and all the public action, like
Any other? I think that you and I are on the same side, but you think we're on opposite sides.
Don't worry about this.
Yes, I've only been to Bihar twice. So, the untruncated Bihar 3 times. That's to say, I was once in Durham and I've been in Patna twice for about a total of 4 or 5 days. So why you are attacking the social capital in a society like that of Bihar. But the trouble is it's incredibly fragmented. Fragmented and